She stood in that grimy pawn shop, her father's old silver ring resting in her palm. It was the last thing she had left, and she was about to sell it. The loan shark looked her up and down, then smiled. He said there was another way. She could pay off her debt. His eyes made his meaning perfectly clear, but instead of letting go of the ring, she gripped it tighter. That was when the door opened. The most powerful mafia boss in Los Angeles walked in. He didn't look at her. He looked at the loan shark with eyes cold as ice, with a voice low and steady, no threat in his tone, yet the entire room stopped breathing. He paid off her debt. Then he offered her a job. Why? Just because she refused to let go? Or because he saw something in her, something she didn't even know she had? The story begins here. If you want to know what happens next, hit that like button to support us. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next part. 1 hour earlier, before the door of the pawn shop opened and changed everything, Conrad Ashford was sitting in his office at the top of the tallest building in downtown Los Angeles. The city lights stretched beneath him like a glowing carpet. But he wasn't looking outside. He was looking at the man standing in front of him. The man's name was Warren, one of his longtime business associates, and he had lowered his head so deeply that he was almost bent in half. Warren had violated an agreement. It wasn't anything major, only a small deal he had concealed so he could skim a little extra profit for himself. But in Conrad Ashford's world, there was no such thing as something small. There were only things that were permitted and things that weren't. Conrad said nothing. He simply sat there, both hands resting on the arms of his chair, his dark brown eyes fixed on Warren without blinking. The silence dragged on. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Warren began to sweat. Beads of perspiration rolled down his temples, but he didn't dare lift a hand to wipe them away. He started to speak, his voice trembling, trying to explain that it was only a small mistake, that he hadn't meant any harm, that he had worked with Conrad for 12 years, and there had never once been a problem. Conrad still didn't speak. He didn't even change his expression. His face looked as though it had been carved from stone, without a single flicker, without the slightest sign of what he was thinking or feeling. Warren kept talking, his voice growing faster, more desperate with every word. He apologized. He promised he would never do it again. He said he was willing to do anything to make up for it. Conrad remained silent, and that silence was the most terrifying thing of all. If Conrad had shouted, Warren would have known what he was facing. If Conrad had threatened him, Warren would have known where the boundary lay. But this silence had no boundary. It stretched on without end, swallowing every explanation, every apology, every promise. In the end, Warren handed down his own punishment. He said he would return the entire profit from that deal, plus 20% more. He said it was fair, that it was what he deserved to suffer. Conrad nodded once. Only once. There were no words, no expression, only the slightest nod, so faint it was almost impossible to notice. Warren understood. He bowed deeply, then turned and walked out of the office. His footsteps were quicker than usual, as though he feared that if he moved even 1 second more slowly, Conrad would change his mind. The door closed. Conrad remained seated, his gaze still fixed on the empty space where Warren had just been standing. Then the door opened again. Miles walked in. Conrad's right hand, the man who had been with him for nearly 20 years, tall and lean, wearing black-framed glasses. He looked more like a university professor than someone who worked in the Underworld. But anyone who knew Miles understood that the appearance was only a shell. Underneath, he was as sharp as a blade. Miles didn't ask about Warren. He knew the outcome without needing to ask. Instead, he reported something else. There was news about Derek Holton. He was active again, expanding his territory, and there were signs that he was preying on people in debt, especially those who had no one to protect them. Conrad didn't react at once. He rose slowly, then walked to the window. He watched the city below, a sprawling ocean of neon and gold. Derek Holton. That name carried the memory of 5 years earlier, when Conrad had discovered what Derek had done to a woman who owed money. He had forced her into a position with no way out, and when Conrad learned the truth, he had removed Derek from the organization immediately. There had been no need for explanation, no need for argument. There were lines no one was allowed to cross. Derek had crossed one, and now he was active again, doing the same kinds of things, thinking that 5 years had been long enough for Conrad to forget. Conrad turned back and looked at Miles. He said only one sentence, his voice low and even, never raised, yet carrying the weight of an entire empire. Go see what he's doing. Miles nodded and left. Conrad stood there for a while longer, looking out through the window. He didn't know that within 1 hour, he would walk into a shabby pawnshop and meet a girl clutching her father's silver ring as though it were the only thing still holding her upright in this world. He didn't know that girl would change everything, but that belonged to an hour later. For now, Conrad Ashford knew only one thing. Derek Holton needed to be reminded of his place. Conrad stepped out of the pawnshop, with Miles following behind him. The polished black car was parked right at the curb, the driver already holding the door open in wait. Derek Holton was still standing inside, his face pale, not daring to move. He knew he had just been humiliated in front of a girl, but he didn't dare say a single word. Not because he was a coward, but because he knew exactly who Conrad Ashford was, and he knew the price of opening his mouth at the wrong moment. Catherine stood inside the shop, still holding the silver ring in her hand, watching the retreating figure of the man who had just paid off all her debt without even asking her name. She didn't understand what had just happened. 1 minute earlier, she had been standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to sell the last thing her father had left her in exchange for a few miserable dollars and Derek's humiliation. 1 minute later, her debt had vanished. The ring was still in her hand, and a stranger had just offered her a job as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. No, there was nothing ordinary here at all. Catherine knew that. She had lived in this world long enough to understand that no one gave anyone anything for free, especially men like him. Men who walked into a room and made the air turn cold by their presence alone. Men who spoke in a low, even voice, but made other people tremble more than any shouted threat ever could. She slipped the ring back onto her ring finger, feeling its familiar weight against her skin. Then she stepped out of the shop. Conrad was standing beside the car, saying something to Miles. He hadn't gotten in yet. Catherine didn't know why her feet moved faster, why she found herself hurrying toward him before she had time to think. She only knew she couldn't let him leave without asking. She stopped a few steps away from him, her breathing slightly uneven. Conrad turned and looked at her. His dark brown eyes weren't cold the way they had been when he looked at Derek, but they weren't warm either. They were simply watching, measuring, waiting to see what she would say. Catherine drew in a deep breath, then asked him directly, "What's the price?" Conrad didn't answer at once. He looked at her for a few more seconds, as though weighing whether the question was worth answering at all. Then he asked in return, "Why do you think there's a price?" Catherine didn't hesitate. "Because no one gives anyone anything for free, especially a man like you." A brief silence followed. Then Conrad tilted his head ever so slightly to one side, a small gesture, almost impossible to notice unless someone was watching carefully. But Catherine was watching carefully, and in his eyes she saw something that looked almost like amusement. Not amusement in the sense of mockery, but amusement in the way of someone who had just seen something unexpected. Conrad said that he wasn't buying her. He wasn't buying gratitude either, because gratitude was the cheapest thing in the world, something anyone could say and almost no one truly kept. But he needed a secretary, someone who knew how to organize, someone who knew how to read ledgers, and most important of all, someone who knew when to stay silent. Catherine frowned. She didn't understand. Out of the millions of people in this city, why would he choose her, a girl he had never met, never known by name, never known anything about, except that she had nearly been forced to sell her father's ring to pay a debt? She asked him plainly, "Why me?" Conrad didn't answer with words. He looked down at her hand, where the silver ring rested on her ring finger. The ring had dulled slightly with time, without a stone, without anything remarkable about it except for the 2 engraved words inside that only the wearer knew were there. Then he spoke. When he suggested another way, "You didn't take the ring off. You held on to it tighter. In my world, people let go of everything to survive. Very few hold on to something tightly enough to say that there are things that can't be sold." Catherine stood there, unable to say a word. She hadn't expected him to notice that detail. She hadn't expected a man like him to care about such a small action. Conrad reached into the pocket of his suit jacket and drew out a black business card with silver lettering. He handed it to her. "Office address. If you decide to take the job, be there at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. If not, then we'll pretend we never met." He didn't wait for her reply. He turned, stepped into the car. Miles followed after him and shut the door. The polished black car glided away, merging into the traffic on the street, disappearing within seconds as though it had never been there at all. Catherine remained standing on the sidewalk, the business card in her hand, staring in the direction the car had gone. The Los Angeles night wind swept past, cold and sharp, but she didn't feel cold. She only felt the ring on her finger weighing more heavily than ever before, and in her mind, his words kept echoing without end. There are things that can't be sold. She looked down at the business card, then down at the ring, then up at the city's false star-filled night sky, where neon lights drowned out every real star above. She didn't know what decision she would make, but she knew one thing. Her life had just turned in an entirely different direction, and there was no way back. Catherine reached her small apartment close to midnight. The apartment was on the 5th floor of an old building on the outskirts of the city, where the elevator was broken more often than it worked, and the walls were so thin she could hear her neighbor's television every night. She didn't turn on the light. She simply sat down on the edge of the bed, looking at the business card in her left hand and the silver ring on her right. Streetlight spilled through the window, enough for her to see the 2 engraved words inside the ring when she turned it beneath the faint light. Still standing. Still standing. The memory came rushing back like a wave she couldn't stop. 6 years earlier, the day she graduated from college, she could still remember that morning clearly. The sunlight pouring through the window of the small house she had shared with her father, the smell of coffee already brewed in the kitchen, and her father's smile when he handed her a small box wrapped in brown paper. Thomas Vale, her father, was a jeweler. Not the kind of jeweler who owned a luxurious shop in the center of the city. He was simply a hired craftsman, a man who had spent 30 years behind someone else's counter, using his gifted hands to create jewelry his own family could never have afforded to buy. But that day, he gave her a silver ring. A ring he had made with his own hands, not for a customer, but for his daughter, he told her, his voice as low and warm as it had always been. I've worked in this trade for 30 years. My hands have touched gold, platinum, and diamonds that belonged to so many other people. But the most valuable thing I've ever made is this silver ring. Inside, I engraved 2 words, still standing. No matter what happens, you keep standing. That's the only inheritance I can leave you. Catherine had held her father that day, never knowing he was hiding something from her. On that very same day, he had received his test results, terminal cancer. He didn't tell her. He didn't want his daughter's graduation day darkened by terrible news. He kept that secret for 3 months, until he could no longer hide it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was Derek Holton. Catherine tightened her grip on the ring when his name came into her mind. Derek Holton, the loan shark she had just seen in the pawn shop tonight. He wasn't a stranger. He was the man who had destroyed her father's life. 4 years earlier, when her father's illness had grown worse and the hospital bills had piled higher and higher, Derek had appeared like a savior. He had lent her father money at an interest rate that seemed reasonable, with paperwork that looked simple enough. Her father, a jeweler who had spent his whole life working with his hands, didn't understand the complicated terms in the contract. He signed papers that he didn't know would strip away everything he owned. 6 months later, Derek seized the small jewelry shop her father had spent a lifetime saving to buy. That shop had been everything her father had, the dream he had carried for 30 years while working for other people, and Derek took it away with nothing more than a signature. Her father died from illness 2 years earlier, in a cheap hospital room, with pale hands and a heart full of bitterness. He didn't die from cancer. He died because everything that had given him a reason to live had been stolen from him. Catherine sat in the darkness, her eyes dry. She had cried every tear out of herself 2 years earlier. Now all she had left was anger. A cold anger, low and smoldering, waiting for the chance to ignite. And tonight, that chance had appeared. She remembered what had happened in the pawn shop, the way Derek had gone pale when Conrad walked in, the way he had lowered his head and hadn't dared look Conrad in the eye, the way he had gone silent like a mouse in front of a cat. Conrad had once been Derek's boss. That meant Conrad knew about Derek, knew about the things he had done, knew about the people he had hurt. If she stayed close to Conrad, she might gain access to information. Information about Derek, about what he had done, about the evidence that could send him to prison or at least force him to pay for what he had done to her father. Catherine looked down at the business card once again. 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. She didn't need to think any further. The decision had been made a long time ago. From the day her father had closed his eyes in that cold hospital room, She simply hadn't had the opportunity. Now she did. She would take the job. Not for the money, not out of gratitude, but because this was the only chance she had to uncover the truth and avenge her father. Catherine lay down on the bed, the ring still on her finger, the business card resting against her chest. She closed her eyes, but she didn't sleep. She was thinking about tomorrow, about Conrad Ashford, about Derek Holton, and about the 2 words engraved inside the ring, still standing. Still standing. The next morning, Catherine stood in front of the high-rise glass tower in downtown Los Angeles, the place the address on the business card had led her to. She wore the only office outfit she owned, a white blouse with a collar already slightly frayed, and a pair of black trousers bought from a second-hand store. The silver ring rested quietly on her ring finger, hidden beneath her sleeve. She drew in a deep breath, then stepped into the lobby. The lobby was vast, its polished marble floor reflecting the glow of the ceiling lights. The receptionist sat behind the desk, looking at her with a measuring stare as though she had wandered into the wrong place. Catherine hadn't even had the chance to say anything when the elevator doors opened. Miles stepped out, still carrying that same tall, lean frame, still wearing his black-framed glasses, looking more like a university professor than the right hand of the most powerful man in the Los Angeles underworld. He looked her up and down, his gaze making no effort to hide its suspicion. Catherine felt that look like a sheet of ice sliding across her skin. She was used to being judged, being looked down on, being stared at as though she didn't belong in a place like this. She didn't let it affect her. She had lived through things far worse. Miles didn't greet her. He only nodded toward the elevator and said curtly, "Follow me." The elevator carried them to the top floor. The doors opened, and Catherine stepped into an entirely different world. The office stretched out before her, glass walls overlooking all of Los Angeles, natural light pouring into every corner. There was no flashy display of luxury, only restraint and power. Every line, every angle, seemed to say that the man who owned this place didn't need to prove a single thing to anyone. Miles led her to a small desk, positioned just outside Conrad's office, only a few steps from the dark wooden door. "This is your place," he said. "Organize the schedule, handle the paperwork, take notes during meetings. Don't ask what doesn't need to be asked. Don't say what doesn't need to be said." "Understood." Catherine nodded. "I understand." Miles looked at her for a moment longer, as though trying to read something on her face. Then he turned and walked away without another word. Catherine sat down in the chair behind the desk and looked around. She realized that from this position, she could observe almost everything. The door to Conrad's office, the hallway leading to the meeting rooms, the elevator, everyone coming and going. She began to work, but her eyes never stopped watching. Her first day passed like a slow-moving film in which she was the only audience. She saw the way everyone in the office reacted whenever Conrad appeared. No one shouted, no one panicked. But the air changed, voices dropped lower, footsteps grew quicker, eyes lowered, as though a wolf had just stepped into the middle of a flock of sheep, and the sheep knew they were still alive only because the wolf wasn't hungry yet. Conrad didn't speak much. He made decisions in short sentences, sometimes with only a single word or a nod. No one dared ask him to repeat himself. No one dared demand an explanation. Once he had spoken, everyone understood what needed to be done and did it immediately. Catherine recorded all of it, not on paper, but in her mind. She memorized the name of every person who passed by, their position, the way they looked at Conrad, the way they looked at her. She learned to read that room the way she would read a book, each gesture a word, each glance a sentence. At the end of the day, when the office had almost emptied out, Catherine stood to leave. She had just stepped into the hallway when Miles appeared and blocked her path. He stood there with his arms folded across his chest, his eyes behind those glasses still as cold as they had been that morning. "Where do you come from?" Miles asked, his voice stripped of feeling. "Why did he choose you?" Catherine didn't step back. She looked directly into his eyes and answered in a calm voice. "He already told you the reason. I only know how to work." Miles didn't blink. In this world, no one only knows how to work. Everyone has a purpose. A tense silence followed. Catherine could feel the weight of that question, the weight of the suspicion Miles was laying across her shoulders. He didn't trust her. He would watch her. He would find any opening, any weakness. But Catherine wasn't afraid. She had lived her whole life under other people's suspicion. She had learned how to survive beneath searching eyes. She had learned how to hide her true purpose behind a composed face. She tilted her head slightly to one side and looked at Miles as though she were studying an interesting riddle. "Then what is your purpose?" That question made Miles go silent. He hadn't expected her to ask one in return. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his eyes shifted, from suspicion into something closer to reassessment. But he didn't answer. He simply turned and walked away, his tall, lean figure disappearing beyond the corner of the hallway. Catherine remained there for another moment, watching after him. She understood that from now on, every move she made would be watched. Every word she spoke would be weighed. Every gesture would be analyzed. She hadn't simply stepped into a new job. She had stepped into a world where one wrong move could cost her everything. But she wasn't afraid. She had already lost everything once. When her father had closed his eyes in that cold hospital room, she had nothing left to lose now. Only a goal left to reach. Catherine stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. When the doors slid shut, she looked down at the silver ring on her finger. Still standing. The first day was over. There were many more days ahead. 2 weeks passed. Catherine arrived at the office at exactly 8:45 every morning and returned home after 6 o'clock every evening. She worked without mistakes, asked few questions, and never let her curiosity show too much. She organized Conrad's schedule flawlessly, recorded every detail of his meetings, handled paperwork quickly and accurately. She became an efficient shadow, always where she needed to be, always with exactly what was needed, yet never drawing attention to herself. But beneath that ordinary appearance, Catherine wasn't only working, she was watching. She learned to read every person in the office the way someone reads open pages of a book. There were people who feared Conrad so deeply that they trembled whenever he passed by, eyes lowered, shoulders drawn in, as though trying to make themselves as small as possible. There were people who truly respected him, who looked at him with admiration rather than fear, ready to do anything he asked, not because they were forced to, but because they believed in him. And there were those who were hiding something, the ones who smiled too much, spoke too sweetly, and let their eyes drift away whenever Conrad looked straight at them. Catherine remembered it all. She knew who was who stood on which side, who might become an ally, and who might become a threat. Knowledge was a weapon, and she was quietly building her own armory. But what she was truly searching for wasn't information about any of these people. What she was searching for was Derek Holton. During lunch breaks, when the office was quieter, Catherine would often go downstairs to the level where the old records archive was kept. She asked for permission to reorganize the storage room, saying she thought it was too messy and wanted to do something useful with her spare time. No one was suspicious. Who would ever suspect a new secretary who wanted to do extra unpaid work? She spent hours in that dusty room, opening one file box after another, reading every name, every date, every transaction. She searched for any trace connected to Derek, but there were too many records, and she didn't know where to begin. She knew Derek had once been connected to Conrad, but she didn't know what that connection had been, how long it had lasted, or how it had ended. Until one day, that afternoon, Catherine was sitting at her desk, reorganizing Conrad's meeting schedule for the following week. Miles walked past and stopped to sign a document she handed him. While signing it, he spoke to another man, his voice low but still clear enough for Catherine to hear. They were talking about an old deal, one that had happened years earlier. The other man mentioned a name, and Miles answered in a cold voice. Derek used to work here before he was thrown out. He violated the rules. The boss doesn't forgive people like that. Catherine didn't lift her head. She kept typing on the keyboard, her eyes on the computer screen, as though she hadn't heard a thing. But inside her, every word was being carved into memory. Derek used to work here. Thrown out. Violated the rules. Miles and the other man walked away. Catherine stayed still for several more minutes, making sure no one was watching her. Then, she opened a new window on the computer and pretended to work, while in truth she was thinking, if Derek had once worked for Conrad, then there had to be a personnel file. There had to be a report explaining why he had been removed. There had to be something, somewhere, that recorded what he had done, and she knew where to look. In the archive she had spent so many hours organizing, there was a separate corner secured by a combination lock, where the old personnel files were kept. She had seen it many times but had never had a reason to open it. Now she did. That afternoon, when nearly everyone had gone home, Catherine went down to the archive once again. She stood in front of that locked section and looked at the 4-digit combination lock. She didn't know the code, but she knew how to figure it out. She had watched Miles open similar locks in the office and had memorized his habits. Miles always used numbers that meant something: a birth date, the year he had started working, a lucky number. Catherine tried a few combinations. The first time, wrong. The second time, wrong. The third time, the lock opened with a soft click. She drew in a deep breath, then opened the door. Inside were dozens of file boxes, arranged by year. She went to the year that, by her calculation, might have been the year Derek had been removed. She searched through one box after another, one folder after another, until she found the name she needed: Derek Holton. Personnel file, disciplinary report, reason for termination. Catherine held the file in her hands, her heart beating faster. She didn't open it right away. She looked around, made sure no one was there, then slipped the file into her bag. She would read it at home, where it was safe, where no one was watching. She locked everything again, put things back exactly as they had been, then left the archive with the same ordinary steps she used every day. No one knew what she had just found. Not yet. But Catherine knew. She had moved one step closer to the truth. A month passed. Catherine had grown used to the rhythm of her new life, to the glass tower in the heart of Los Angeles, to the top-floor office overlooking the city, to the faces that passed by each day, and the meetings that stretched on for hours. She had grown used to the way Conrad made decisions through silence, to the way Miles watched her through the lenses of his black-framed glasses, to the way everyone lowered their voices whenever the boss walked past. She worked steadily, precisely, without mistakes, and she kept searching for information about Derek in every spare moment, each small fragment slowly forming a larger picture. But there was something she didn't realize. While she was watching everyone else, someone was also watching her. Conrad Ashford had begun to notice his new secretary, not because of her appearance, not because she was trying to impress him, but because of the small things other people couldn't do. He noticed the way she arranged documents. Everything had a system, a logic, a structure based on priority and time. When he needed a document from 3 weeks earlier, she found it in less than a minute. When he needed information from an old meeting, she handed him a complete set of notes, with the main points clearly marked. He noticed the way she recorded meetings. While the previous secretaries had written down only what was said aloud, she wrote down what wasn't said as well: who went silent, and when, who avoided looking at whom, who agreed too quickly without thinking. Small details other people overlooked, but details that were sometimes the most important of all. And he noticed the way she handled the people who came asking to see him. There were those who tried to push past her, demanding to see him immediately, using an arrogant tone as though she were nothing more than a meaningless obstacle. She didn't get angry, didn't grow weak, didn't give in. She was polite but firm, smiling but unshaken. She told them that Mr. Ashford was busy, and that if they wanted to see him, they needed to make an appointment like everyone else. No one got past her unless she allowed it. One afternoon, when the office had grown quieter, Conrad called her in. Catherine stepped through the dark wooden door, her heart beating a little faster than usual. It was the first time he had called her into his office alone since the day she started working there. She didn't know whether this was good news or bad. She didn't know whether he had discovered anything yet. Conrad sat behind his desk, the afternoon sunlight falling through the glass and casting long bands of light across the floor. He didn't look at her right away. He was reading through a file, his face expressionless as always. Then he pushed the file across the desk toward her. "Read it. Tell me what you think." Catherine picked up the file, surprised. It was a business contract, a partnership with a real estate company to develop a major project on the outskirts of Los Angeles. She didn't understand why he was asking for her opinion. She was only a secretary. She had no place in decisions like this, but she didn't ask. She simply did as he told her. She read every page, every clause, every figure. She read slowly and carefully, missing nothing, and she found it. On page 17, in a small clause written in dense legal language, there was a trap. If Conrad signed that contract, he would bear full responsibility for any losses in the first 3 years, while the partner would be responsible only for profits. In other words, if the project failed, Conrad would lose everything. If the project succeeded, the partner would take the larger share. She looked up and met Conrad's eyes, which were waiting. She spoke plainly. The clause on page 17, section 3.4. It's written to conceal a serious imbalance. If you sign this contract as it stands, you'll carry all the risk while the other party will lose almost nothing. I suggest revising this clause so that responsibility and profit are divided according to each side's actual share of the investment. Conrad didn't say whether she was right or wrong. He didn't nod in agreement or shake his head in opposition. He only looked at her for a long moment, his eyes unreadable, then signaled for her to leave. You may go. Catherine lowered her head in acknowledgement and left the office, not knowing whether she had just passed or failed. The next day, she saw the contract signed and sent out. The clause on page 17 had been revised exactly as she had proposed. She said nothing. She didn't boast. She simply went on working as she always did. But she understood what had happened. Conrad had tested her. He had wanted to know whether she had real ability or whether she was only a lucky girl who had been chosen by chance. And she had passed. From that day on, Conrad would sometimes ask for her opinion on small matters. Not always listening, but asking. And Catherine knew what that meant. He was beginning to trust her. She didn't know whether that was a good thing or a bad one, because the more he trusted her, the more opportunity she had to gain access to information about Derek. But she also had more to lose if she was ever discovered. That night, Catherine stayed at the office later than usual. Conrad had an important meeting early the next morning, and she needed to prepare all the documents before going home. The office had long since emptied out, leaving only the light from her desk lamp and the steady hum of the air conditioning in the silence. She was checking the final report one last time when she heard footsteps. She looked up and saw Miles walking toward her. He hadn't gone home either, perhaps for reasons of his own that she didn't know and didn't ask about. She thought he would walk straight past, as he always did, but he didn't. Miles stopped right beside her desk. She looked up at him, slightly surprised. In more than a month, he had never once stopped on his own to speak with her beyond the necessary exchanges about work. He still watched her, she knew that, but he always kept his distance. Miles didn't look into her eyes. He was looking down at her hand, where the silver ring rested quietly on her ring finger, catching the desk light. What does that ring mean to you? Catherine hadn't expected that question. She could have lied. She could have avoided it. She could have said it was only an ordinary piece of jewelry, nothing special. But there was something in Miles's voice that made her not want to lie. It wasn't simple curiosity. There was something deeper there. Something like searching, as though he were trying to understand something he himself couldn't quite name. Catherine looked down at the ring, then back up at Miles. She decided to tell the truth. Part of the truth. My father was a jeweler. His whole life, he made thousands of pieces of jewelry for other people. Gold, platinum, diamonds, all the luxuries he could never afford to buy for his own family. But this is the only thing he ever made for his family. For me. She turned the ring on her finger, revealing the inside where the words were engraved. Inside are 2 words, still standing. He said it was the only inheritance he could leave me. Not money, not property, only a reminder that no matter what happened, I had to keep standing. Miles stood there, listening in silence. He didn't interrupt. He didn't comment. There was no expression on his face, but his eyes behind the black-framed glasses seemed to be looking at someplace very far away, somewhere Catherine couldn't see. When she finished speaking, the silence stretched on for a few more seconds. Catherine didn't know what he was thinking. She didn't know what he would say. She had been ready for any reaction, a cutting remark, another question, or simply for him to turn and walk away as he always did. But what Miles did next surprised her. He nodded once, slowly, as though acknowledging something. Then he spoke, his voice so low that Catherine had to lean forward to hear him clearly. My father left nothing at all. I was already on my own by the time I was 10. The sentence was short, stripped of obvious emotion, as though he were speaking about the weather or a number in a financial report. But Catherine heard what Miles didn't say. She heard the emptiness. She heard the years of growing up without a father. She heard a 10-year-old child standing there, watching the door close behind the man he called father, and that door never opened again. Miles didn't wait for her response. He turned and walked away, his tall, lean figure slowly disappearing beyond the corner of the hallway. Catherine sat there alone, watching after him until there was nothing left to see but darkness. Then she understood. Miles wasn't an enemy. He didn't hate her. He was only protecting the one thing he had, his loyalty to Conrad. Conrad was the man who had given him a place to belong, a purpose, a family that had been missing from his life since he was a young boy. Miles watched her, doubted her, not because he was cruel, but because he was afraid of losing the only thing he had left. She understood that feeling. She was protecting the only things she still had too, the memory of her father, the silver ring, and the promise that she would reclaim justice for him. Catherine looked down at the ring, her finger brushing lightly across the slightly tarnished silver surface. The engraved words inside seemed to remind her again. Still standing, she rose, turned off the desk lamp, and left the office. The Los Angeles night was cold and still. But inside her, something had changed. From that night on, whenever Miles looked at her, his eyes were no longer as cold as before. Not warm, not friendly, but no longer carrying the frozen suspicion of those first weeks. Perhaps he still didn't fully trust her, but he had begun to understand her. And sometimes, being understood matters more than being trusted. After that night with Miles, Catherine became even more determined in her search. She already had Derek's personnel file from the archive, but it contained only the most basic information: the date he had started working, his position, and the brief line terminated from association, without any explanation of the reason. She needed more than that. She needed to know exactly what Derek had done to be cast out, and she needed proof. She asked to take on the job of organizing the old archive officially. She told Miles that the records room was far too disordered, that if anyone ever needed to find a document it could take hours, that she could reorganize it in her spare time, without affecting her main work. Miles looked at her with that measuring gaze of his, but he didn't object. Perhaps after that night, he saw her a little differently. Or perhaps he simply thought no one could be foolish enough to volunteer for the filthiest work in the office without some harmless desire to appear useful. Either way, she was approved. Over the next 2 weeks, Catherine spent every lunch break and every evening after work in the dusty room beneath the building. There were dozens of old file boxes, some from 10 years earlier, some older still. The papers had yellowed, the ink had faded, and the smell of damp decay crept into every corner. She turned over every folder, every page, every line of writing. She searched for Derek Holton's name in every report, every memo, every note. Most of what she found meant nothing. Old transactions, long finished meetings, numbers that no longer carried any value. But she didn't give up. She knew it was somewhere in that mountain of paper. She only needed patience. At last, on the 12th day, she found it, a thin file, tucked in among old financial reports, as though someone had deliberately hidden it there. On the outside was a line that read, "Internal report, not for circulation." Catherine opened it, her heart beating faster. Inside was a detailed report explaining why Derek Holton had been removed from Conrad Ashford's organization. She read every line, her eyes never leaving the page. The report said that 5 years earlier, Derek had been in charge of the organization's lending division. His job had been to manage small loans to local businesses, collect debts on time, and keep the cash flow steady. He had exploited a vulnerable family in deep debt, people who were struggling to survive and had no one to protect them. He had forced her into a position with no escape, threatening to take the only house she had if she didn't do what he demanded. The report didn't state clearly what he had demanded, only that it was a grave violation of the organization's principles. But Catherine understood. She understood all too well, because Derek had done the same thing to her father. He preyed on the weak. He cornered them when they had nowhere left to turn. He took everything they had. The report went on to say that when Conrad learned the truth, he had removed Derek from the organization immediately. No meeting, no discussion, only a decisive order that couldn't be reversed. Derek had been cut off from every connection, every privilege, every form of protection. He had been thrown out like a stray dog. Catherine read that part again and again. She hadn't expected it. She had thought Conrad was the same as Derek, that all men in that world were alike, that they cared only about money and power and had no boundaries at all. But she had been wrong. Conrad had boundaries. He had principles he would never allow anyone to cross. He didn't accept the exploitation of people who couldn't protect themselves. He didn't accept the use of power to grind the weak into dust. When Derek violated that line, Conrad cast him out without hesitation. Catherine sat there for a long time, the file still open across her lap. She thought about Conrad, about the way he had looked at her in the pawn shop that night, about the words, "There are things that can't be sold." She was beginning to understand why he had said them. because he believed in that too. But this new understanding didn't make her forget her goal. She looked back through the file, searching for what she truly needed. Proof of what Derek had done to her father. There was nothing. This file spoke only about the incident from 5 years earlier, about the widow Derek had preyed upon. There wasn't a single line about Thomas Vale, about the jewelry shop that had been taken, about the forged loan papers. Catherine closed the file, disappointment rising inside her. She had found an important piece of the puzzle, but that piece wasn't enough to complete the picture. She needed to find more. She needed to know what Derek was doing now, what ties he still had, what proof existed of the other crimes he had committed. She put the file back exactly where she had found it, and erased every sign that she had ever read it. Then she left the archive, stepped into the elevator, and returned to her desk. No one knew what she had just found, but Catherine knew, and she wasn't going to stop until she found all of it. A few days after Catherine found the file on Derek, an important meeting took place in Conrad's office. The meeting lasted nearly 4 hours, with tense voices carrying through the closed door. Catherine sat at her desk outside, writing out the schedule for the following week, but her ears were still listening. She couldn't make out the words, only the rise and fall of voices, the heavy stretches of silence, and finally the sound of the door opening as the attendees came out one by one. Their faces were tight with strain, and a few of them looked as though they had just survived a battle. They moved quickly past Catherine's desk. No one looked at her. No one said a word. Miles was the last to leave. He paused for a second, glanced toward Conrad's office door, then looked at Catherine. "He isn't going home tonight," Miles said in a low voice. "Don't leave him alone for too long." Then he stepped into the elevator and disappeared. Catherine didn't understand what that meant. She didn't know whether Miles was asking something of her or simply letting her know the situation. But she didn't go home. She stayed, continued working, her eyes drifting now and then toward the office door, still shut and silent. Near 10 o'clock that night, she finished her last task. The office lights had all been turned off, leaving only the glow from her desk lamp and the strip of light slipping out from beneath Conrad's door. She rose, intending to knock and ask whether he needed anything before she left. But when she got closer, she saw that the door was slightly open. Conrad stood by the window with his back to her, looking out over Los Angeles. The city lights reflected against the glass, scattering into tiny lines of brightness like millions of stars fallen to the earth. He stood there alone, silent and motionless. Catherine was about to turn away, not wanting to disturb him, but Conrad's voice came without his turning around. "What does that ring mean to you?" Catherine stopped. She hadn't expected that question. She hadn't expected him to notice the ring she wore every day. She looked down at her hand, where the silver ring rested quietly on her ring finger, reflecting the hallway light. She could have lied, she could have deflected, but there was something in the air that night that made her not want to. Maybe it was the loneliness she could see in the line of his back. Maybe it was what Miles had said before leaving. Maybe it was because she had read the file on Derek and had begun to understand Conrad in a different way. "It reminds me that no matter what happens, I have to keep standing," Catherine said, her voice soft but clear. Conrad didn't turn around. He kept looking out at the window, but she knew he was listening. "Your father is gone?" he asked. 2 years now," Catherine replied. The silence stretched for a few more seconds. Then Conrad kept his gaze on the window, his voice lowering, as though he were speaking more to himself than to her. "So is mine. 15 years now." Catherine said nothing. She didn't offer condolences, didn't try to comfort him, didn't try to make the moment less heavy. She knew such words were meaningless. She had heard enough of them already, from people who didn't understand, from people who only said them because they thought they should, from people who believed that a few empty phrases could soften the pain of losing a father. Nothing softened it. She knew that. And perhaps Conrad knew it too. The two of them stood there in silence, each carrying a wound of their own, with no need to explain, no need to prove anything. Just two people who understood that they had both lost something that could never be replaced. Then Conrad spoke again, his voice still low and even, but with something softer in it. "My father taught me one thing before he died," he said. "Power isn't something to possess. Power is something you use to protect what you believe is right." He turned his head and looked at Catherine for the first time since she had come near. His dark brown eyes were no longer as cold as they usually were. There was something deeper there, something like weariness, like loneliness, like the burden of a man who had carried too much on his shoulders for far too long. "I don't always do the right thing," he said, "but I try." Catherine looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see Conrad Ashford as the most powerful man in the Los Angeles underworld. He wasn't the man who could make an entire room stop breathing with nothing more than his presence. He wasn't the architect everyone feared and respected. He was only a man who had lost his father at 18, who had been forced to carry an empire while still far too young, who had learned how to become hard so he wouldn't be crushed. He was only a man carrying wounds of his own, just like her. Catherine didn't say anything. She only nodded once, gently, as though saying that she understood. Then she turned and left, leaving him alone with the darkness and the city lights. But when she stepped into the elevator, she realized that something had changed. She no longer looked at Conrad as a tool for reaching her goal. She was beginning to look at him as a human being. Derek Holton didn't forget what happened at the pawnshop that night. He didn't forget the way Conrad had walked in as though he didn't exist. Didn't forget the way he had paid the girl's debt without even looking at him. Didn't forget the way he had been forced to stand there in silence like a dog being scolded by its former master in front of a stranger. That humiliation burned inside him for weeks, smoldering like a bed of coals waiting for the day it could rise into open flame. And when he learned that the girl was now working for Conrad, that fire began to spread. He started digging into her life. It wasn't hard to find information on her. Catherine Vale, 28 years old, formerly an accountant at a small company before being dismissed. Living alone in a cheap apartment on the outskirts of the city. No family, no relatives, no one to protect her. But what made Derek stop was the surname, Vale. He knew that name. He remembered that name. Thomas Vale, the aging jeweler he had deceived 2 years earlier. The man who had signed loan papers he didn't understand, lost his jewelry shop, lost everything, and then died with bitterness rotting inside him. Derek remembered his face. He remembered the trembling hands as he signed his name. He remembered the look of despair when the old man realized he had been cheated. He even remembered the weak, pleading voice he had ignored. And now that man's daughter was working for Conrad Ashford. That wasn't chance. It couldn't be chance. Derek sat in his private office, a small room behind the pawnshop where he ran operations no one else was meant to know about. He stared at the photograph of Catherine that one of his men had just sent him, taken secretly as she left Conrad's building that evening. He smiled, a cold smile that never reached his eyes. This girl wasn't simple. She hadn't come to the pawnshop that night by accident. She was beside Conrad for a reason. Maybe she was searching for something. Maybe she was waiting for an opportunity. Maybe she thought she could avenge her father by slipping into the world of the men who had ruined him. Derek called one of his men in. He spoke in an even voice, but it was loaded with threat. "She thinks she's smart. Let's see who's smarter." But Catherine wasn't his main target. She was only a small piece on a much larger board, one he had been laying out for the past 5 years. 5 years since the day Conrad had thrown him out of the organization like a stray dog. 5 years spent rebuilding from nothing, quietly, patiently, waiting for the right moment. Derek didn't only want revenge on Catherine. He wanted to bring Conrad down. He wanted to take back everything that should have been his. He wanted to watch Conrad lose everything, the same way Conrad had made him lose everything 5 years earlier. That night, Derek made the calls he had been waiting years to make. He contacted 3 families, old enemies of Conrad, the ones who had been pushed into the shadows when Conrad rose to power. They were still there, still waiting, still carrying hatred that hadn't cooled with time. He told them the moment had come. He had inside knowledge from the years he had worked for Conrad. He knew the weak points in that empire. He knew exactly where to strike to make it collapse. And they agreed. They were ready to provide money, men, and whatever support was needed. All they needed was a plan. And Derek had a plan. He had spent 5 years preparing it, sharpening every detail, waiting for the exact right moment. Now, with Catherine's appearance, that moment had arrived. He would use her as a piece on the board. He would make Conrad lose focus. And when Conrad wasn't looking, he would strike the fatal blow. Derek looked out the window, where the lights of Los Angeles flickered in the night. The same city Conrad was looking down on from his high-rise tower, but they were looking at it with different eyes. Conrad looked at it like a king looking over his kingdom. Derek looked at it like an invader studying land he was about to conquer. The game was beginning to escalate, and no one knew how it would end. That evening, Catherine left the office later than usual. Conrad was away on a short business trip. Miles had gone with him, and she had stayed behind to finish some lingering work. When she stepped out of the elevator in the basement, the parking garage was almost empty. Only a few cars were scattered beneath the pale yellow lights, and the sound of her footsteps echoed through the silence. She was walking toward her car when she realized someone was waiting. Derek Holton was leaning against the car parked beside hers, his arms folded across his chest, a cold smile resting on his mouth. He wasn't alone. Two large men stood a few steps away, their faces expressionless, their eyes fixed on Catherine. But they didn't move closer. They simply stood there, a reminder that Derek could do anything he wanted if he chose to do it. Catherine stopped. Her heart began to beat faster, but she didn't let it show on her face. She had lived through too many moments of fear in her life, and had learned how to hide fear behind a mask of calm. She didn't run. She didn't step back. She only stood there, looking straight at Derek, waiting. Derek pushed himself away from the car and walked toward her. He stopped a few steps from her, close enough for her to see the triumphant smile on his face, but far enough that it couldn't be called a direct threat. "Thomas Vale's daughter," Derek said, his voice light, as though he were making small talk with an old acquaintance. "Your father was a skilled craftsman. It's a pity he trusted people too easily." Catherine felt her blood heat when she heard him speak of her father in that tone. Her hand automatically tightened around the ring on her ring finger, feeling the edge of the metal press into her skin. She said nothing. She only looked at him and waited. Derek went on, his voice still light but filled with hidden menace. "I know what you've been looking for in Conrad's files. I have people everywhere, even in places you think are safe. My advice is that you stop, because if you don't, what happened to your father could happen to you." Catherine felt her body go rigid, but she didn't step back. She knew that if she showed fear, Derek would win. He would know he could control her with fear, and she would never give him that power. She looked him straight in the eye, her voice calmer than she had expected it to be. "You can't touch me, because if you do, you'll have Conrad to deal with." Derek laughed, a dry sound without the slightest trace of amusement. "Conrad? You think he'll protect you forever? In this world, no one protects anyone for free. Sooner or later, you'll understand that." He tilted his head, looking at her as though she were an interesting piece of prey. "Do you know why he chose you? Not because you're special, because you're convenient. You appeared at the right time, in the right place. He needed a secretary, and you needed a job. That's all. Don't lie to yourself and pretend it's anything more than that." Catherine didn't answer. She knew Derek was trying to make her doubt, trying to break whatever trust might have been growing between her and Conrad. That was how he operated, breaking things from the inside, planting seeds of doubt and waiting for them to grow. But she wouldn't let him succeed. Derek took one step closer, lowering his voice. "I'll give you a choice. Leave this place. Forget everything you've found. Go live your ordinary life. Or stay and see what happens. But if you choose to stay, don't blame me for not warning you." He turned away and walked back toward his car. His two men followed behind him without a word. Before getting in, Derek looked back at her one last time. "Oh, and one more thing. If you're thinking about telling Conrad about this meeting, think again, because then I'll have to tell him the real reason you're here. And I'm not sure how he'll react when he learns that the girl he's starting to trust is actually investigating him." He laughed, then got into the car and drove away. The black vehicle swept past Catherine and disappeared down the road leading out, leaving her alone in the empty garage. Catherine stood there, her hand still clenched around the ring, her heart beating fast but not trembling. She drew in a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Derek knew. He knew who she was. He knew what she had been searching for, and he was using that knowledge to threaten her. If he told Conrad first, if he revealed that she had come here with her own hidden purpose, she would lose everything. Her job, her access to information, her chance to avenge her father. And worse, she might lose more than that. She didn't know how Conrad would react when he learned the truth. Would he understand, or would he see her as a traitor and treat her the way he treated other traitors? Catherine looked down at the ring on her hand. The two engraved words inside seemed to remind her again, still standing. She couldn't let Derek control the situation. She couldn't wait for him to strike first. She had to act. She had to tell Conrad the truth before Derek had the chance. She walked to her car, opened the door, and sat inside. Her hand trembled slightly on the steering wheel, but she didn't let that stop her. Tomorrow morning, when Conrad returned, She would tell him everything. Whatever the outcome, she would face it, because that was what her father had taught her. Keep standing, no matter what happens. The next morning, when Conrad returned from his business trip, Catherine was already waiting at the office. She hadn't slept at all the night before. She had lain awake in bed, turning over in her mind what she would say, how Conrad might react, all the possible ways this could end. But no matter how many times she thought it through, she always arrived at the same conclusion. She had to tell the truth, before Derek had the chance to do it first. Conrad walked into the office at 9 o'clock that morning, with Miles behind him. He gave her a brief look, nodded in greeting as he always did, then went straight into his office. Catherine waited another 15 minutes, giving him time to settle in, giving Miles time to leave and attend to other matters. Then she rose, walked to Conrad's office door, and knocked. "Come in." His voice came from inside. Catherine opened the door, stepped in, then closed it behind her. Conrad was sitting behind his desk, reading through a file. He looked up when he saw her shut the door, one brow lifting slightly. She never closed the door when she entered his office. "There's something I need to tell you," Catherine said, her voice steadier than she had expected. "Something important." Conrad set the file down, leaned back in his chair, and looked at her. He said nothing, only waited. That was his way, always waiting, always listening before judging. Catherine drew in a deep breath. Then she began. "My real name is Catherine Vale. My father was Thomas Vale, a jeweler. 4 years ago, when my father became seriously ill and needed money for treatment, he borrowed money from a lender. That lender was Derek Holton." Conrad didn't react. His face remained expressionless, his eyes fixed on her without blinking. She couldn't tell what he was thinking, but she went on. "Derek tricked my father into signing fraudulent loan documents. He didn't understand the complicated terms buried inside them. 6 months later, Derek seized my father's jewelry shop, the only thing he had. My father died from illness 2 years ago, in a cheap hospital room, with pale hands and a heart full of bitterness." Catherine's voice trembled slightly when she reached that part, but she didn't stop. She had come too far to stop now. "I took this job for more than money. I took it because I knew Derek had once worked for you. I thought that by staying close to you, I might find information about him, find evidence of what he did to my father and to other people. I want justice for my father." She stopped, looking directly into Conrad's eyes. "I'm not apologizing for having my own purpose, but I have never done anything to harm you or your organization. I only want justice for my father." The silence stretched on. Conrad said nothing. He only looked at her, his face still expressionless as stone, his eyes still unreadable. Catherine felt every second pass like an hour, her heart pounding so hard she thought the whole room might hear it. Then Conrad spoke. "Why tell me now? Why not keep hiding it?" Catherine had prepared for that question. "Because Derek knows. He met me last night in the parking garage. He knows who I am, and he knows what I've been searching for. And I'd rather you hear it from me than from him." Conrad looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, the gesture so small it was almost impossible to catch. "You chose to tell the truth when you didn't have to," he said, his voice low and even as always, but with something different in it. "That matters more than the fact that you hid your purpose in the beginning." Catherine could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had prepared herself for anger. She had prepared herself to be dismissed. She had prepared herself for the worst. But she hadn't prepared for this. Conrad rose and walked to the window, looking down at the city. "Derek violated my principles 5 years ago," he said without turning around. "I removed him because he preyed on people who couldn't protect themselves. If what you're telling me is true, then he's still doing exactly that." Catherine didn't say anything. She only stood there, waiting. Conrad turned and looked at her. "I'm not a good man," he said. "I've done many things the outside world would call wrong. But I have boundaries." And Derek crossed them. He walked back toward her and stopped a few steps away. "You want justice for your father. I want Derek to pay for what he's done. It seems we have the same goal." Catherine looked at him, her heart still beating fast, but now for a different reason. "What are you saying?" Conrad didn't smile. His face was as serious as ever, but something in his eyes had changed, a recognition, a respect that hadn't been there before. "From now on, you're not only my secretary," he said. "You're an ally, and together, we're going to deal with Derek Holton." Catherine nodded, unable to speak. She stepped out of the office, her legs slightly unsteady, but not from fear. From relief. She had told the truth, and the truth hadn't destroyed her. It had set her free. Derek didn't wait any longer. He had been preparing for this moment for 5 years, ever since the day Conrad threw him out of the organization like a stray dog. 5 years of quietly building his strength, gathering information, and connecting with people who shared the same hatred. And now, the moment had come. He didn't only want revenge on Catherine. Thomas Vale's daughter was only a small piece on a much larger board. He wanted to bring Conrad Ashford down. He wanted the empire Conrad had built over 15 years to collapse completely. He wanted to watch Conrad lose everything, just as he himself had lost everything 5 years earlier. Over those years, Derek had aligned himself with 3 families that had once been Conrad's rivals. Families forced into the shadows when Conrad rose to power, men who had carried their hatred for years and waited for the chance to strike back. Derek gave them what they didn't have: inside information. He knew how Conrad operated his empire, knew the weak points in the system, knew who could be bought and who could be threatened. In return, the 3 families provided money and men. This wasn't an alliance built on trust. It was an alliance built on shared hatred, and sometimes, shared hatred is stronger than any loyalty. The attack began quietly, like small cracks appearing in a solid wall. First, a business partner unexpectedly pulled his investment from a major project, offering only some vague excuse about a change in strategy. Then an important contract was canceled at the last minute, without explanation. Then a longtime supplier suddenly ended the relationship. Each event on its own looked like the ordinary risks of doing business, but when they happened one after another, within the space of a few weeks, the larger picture began to sharpen. This wasn't coincidence. It was a coordinated attack. Conrad realized that, but he still didn't know who was behind it. He sat in his office, listening as Miles reported the growing losses, his face still expressionless as stone, but his eyes had changed. There was something sharper in them now, something more dangerous. "Someone is coordinating this attack," Miles said, his voice more strained than usual. "This isn't random. The partners pulling out all have connections to one another, even if only indirectly. And people who used to be loyal to us are beginning to hesitate, as though they're waiting to see who wins before they choose a side." Conrad nodded and said nothing for a long moment. Then he stood, walked to the window, and looked down at Los Angeles. The city still stretched beneath him, still glittered with lights, still belonged to him. But for how much longer? "Find out who's behind this," Conrad said, his voice low and even. But Catherine, sitting at the desk outside, could feel the weight in every word. "I need to know who's doing this, and why." Miles nodded and left. Catherine watched him go, then looked toward Conrad, still standing by the window. She knew who was behind this attack: Derek Holton. He had warned her, threatened her, let her know that he was planning something much larger, but she had no proof. She had only instinct and a handful of unfinished pieces. She needed to find evidence, and she needed to move quickly, because time wasn't on their side. A week passed. The situation grew worse with every day that went by. Catherine sat at her desk, watching what was happening around her, and she realized that Conrad's empire was beginning to shake from within. The men who had once bowed their heads before Conrad were starting to avoid his gaze. They still greeted him when they saw him, still obeyed his orders, but their eyes had changed. They no longer looked at him with the absolute awe they once had. They looked at him with calculation, like animals judging whether the leader of the pack was still strong enough to protect them. Those who had once been afraid were beginning to whisper. Catherine heard hurried conversations in the hallways, voices dropping low whenever she walked by, quick glances that flicked toward her and then away. She couldn't hear the exact words, but she knew what they were talking about. Rumors. Rumors spread like wildfire, impossible to control, impossible to smother. Conrad was weakening. Someone else was about to replace him. Those who chose the wrong side would pay the price. It was time to choose a side. Miles reported to Conrad every day, and every day the news was worse. Another investor pulled out. Another contract was canceled. Another supplier ended a partnership, and worst of all, some of the men beneath them were beginning to waver. Not many, only a few, but enough to be dangerous. In this world, it only took a handful of traitors in the right positions to destroy everything. One evening, after everyone had gone, The office sank into darkness and silence. Only the light from Conrad's office remained, where he still stood by the window, looking down over Los Angeles. The city still spread beneath him, still glittering with lights like millions of stars fallen to the earth. The city he had once controlled. The city his father had spent a lifetime building influence over. The city that was now slipping through his fingers one piece at a time. Miles stood a few steps away from him, his face more tired than Catherine had ever seen it. He had followed Conrad for nearly 20 years, had helped him build this empire from the earliest days, and now he was watching it collapse. "Maybe we should pull back," Miles said, his voice so quiet it was almost as though he didn't want to hear the words himself. "Wait for another opportunity." Conrad didn't turn. He kept looking out through the glass, his back straight, his shoulders rigid, like a soldier standing before his final battle. "My father spent 15 years building everything I have now," he said, his voice low and even, but carrying a heaviness Catherine had never heard in it before. "I don't have the right to lose it in 15 days. The silence stretched out. No one spoke. Catherine stood in the corner of the room, looking at the two men in front of her. One had followed Conrad for 20 years, had watched him grow from an 18-year-old boy who had lost his father into the most powerful man in the Los Angeles underworld. The other had arrived less than 3 months earlier, carrying her own purpose, her own secrets, her own wounds. But now, all of them were standing on the same ship, and the ship was sinking. Catherine looked down at the ring on her hand. The 2 engraved words inside seemed to remind her again. Still standing, still standing. She drew in a deep breath. Then she spoke. "I may have a way." Conrad and Miles both turned to look at her. Conrad's eyes were sharp, measuring. Miles's expression was one of surprise, not expecting her to speak at a moment like this. Catherine stepped closer and looked straight into Conrad's eyes. "Let me see the financial records," she said. "I'm an accountant. I know how to read what isn't written down." Miles opened his mouth as though to object, but Conrad lifted a hand and stopped him. He looked at Catherine for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. Then he asked, "What do you think you can find?" Catherine answered, "Money never disappears. It always goes somewhere. If someone is coordinating this attack, there will be a trail in the movement of money. I can find that trail." Conrad looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded. Conrad didn't give Catherine access to the entire file system. He was a careful man. Always careful, even with the people he had called allies. In his world, trust wasn't something given all at once. It was built piece by piece, like bricks laid one over another until they formed a wall. Catherine understood that. She didn't complain. He showed her only the transactions connected to the partners who had pulled their investments over the past few weeks. Information that an enemy might also have been able to uncover if they had paid close enough attention. There was nothing too sensitive. Nothing that could put the organization in danger if it fell into the wrong hands. That was Conrad's way of protecting himself, always giving just enough for someone else to do the work, but never enough for them to betray him. Miles sat beside her through the entire process, watching every page she read. He didn't say much. He simply sat there, his eyes on the computer screen every time she opened a new file, one hand resting on the desk as though ready to stop her if she went too far. Catherine didn't let that affect her. She focused on the numbers in front of her, on the lines of transactions, on the hidden patterns buried inside what looked like a heap of disorder. She was an accountant. This was what she had been trained to do. This was what she did best. After an hour of silence, Miles finally spoke. "What are you looking for?" Catherine didn't lift her eyes from the screen. "Money never disappears," she answered. "It always goes somewhere. If I find out where it's going, I'll find out who's controlling it." Miles looked at her and said nothing for a long moment. Then he gave the faintest nod, a gesture so small it was almost impossible to notice. But Catherine felt it. Something in his eyes had changed. The complete suspicion of those first weeks was gone. The cold caution that had shadowed her every move was gone too. Now there was something closer to curiosity, to expectation, as though he wanted to see what she could actually do. Catherine kept working. She opened file after file, read every line of every transaction, and wrote down the irregular points in a notebook beside her. She didn't explain to Miles what she was doing. She simply did it. The first night passed. The office lights were still burning while the city outside disappeared into darkness. Catherine drank coffee to keep herself awake, her eyes never leaving the screen, her hand never stopping its notes. Miles still sat beside her, sometimes standing to get water or step outside for a cigarette, but always returning within minutes. He didn't leave her alone with those records. Not because he didn't trust her, but because it was his job. Protect Conrad. Protect the organization. Protect everything they had built. When dawn began to rise along the horizon, Catherine finally stopped. She looked down at her notes. The numbers, the patterns, the fragments that were slowly forming a picture. She hadn't found the answer yet, but she was moving in the right direction. She could feel it in every page, in every line of every transaction, in every small detail other people might have overlooked, but she hadn't. She needed more time. She needed to dig deeper, and she would. 3 sleepless nights. Catherine read through hundreds of pages of documents, her eyes bloodshot from exhaustion, her hands trembling faintly from too much coffee, her head aching from staring at a computer screen for far too long. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Every page she read was one small piece of a larger picture. And that picture was slowly taking shape in front of her, becoming clearer with every passing hour. Miles was still watching her, but he no longer sat beside her through the entire night. From time to time, he would stop by, set a fresh cup of coffee next to her, then leave again without a word. That was his way of offering support, silent but present. On the first night, Catherine found the connection between the partners who had withdrawn their money. They hadn't pulled out at random. They were all tied to the same source, a shell company called Westfield Holdings. On paper, it was a small real estate company, nothing unusual, nothing worth noticing. But when Catherine dug deeper, she discovered that Westfield Holdings was where the money was flowing. Every partner who pulled out had conducted business with that company before deciding to walk away from Conrad. On the second night, Catherine found the man behind Westfield Holdings. She had to dig through layers of subsidiaries, false names, and fake addresses. But in the end, she found him. Derek Holton. He was the one controlling Westfield Holdings. He was the one who had contacted Conrad's partners, persuaded them to withdraw their support, and coordinated this financial attack. Catherine wasn't surprised. She had suspected Derek from the very beginning. But now she had proof. On the third night, Catherine found something that sent a chill through her. She was reading Westfield Holdings transactions when she noticed an unusual pattern. Money wasn't only flowing into the company from the partners. It was also flowing out, to addresses she didn't recognize at first. Small payments, broken into pieces to avoid detection, but when added together, they became enormous. Catherine began tracing those addresses, and she found that they belonged to men inside Conrad's organization. The subordinates who had been wavering, the ones Miles had reported as hesitating over which side to choose. Derek was buying them. He was using money from illegal sources, money from the loan sharking operations he was still running, to bribe Conrad's men. He was building an army inside Conrad's empire, waiting for the right moment to strike from within. But that still wasn't the worst of it. Catherine kept digging, and she found another series of transactions. Large sums transferred to 3 different addresses over the past few days. When she traced those addresses, she realized they belonged to 3 families that had once been Conrad's rivals. The families forced into the shadows years earlier and waiting for their chance at revenge. Derek didn't only want to weaken Conrad. He was coordinating with those 3 families to overthrow him completely. And from what Catherine could read in the transactions, from the money being moved, from the preparations already underway, she realized one thing. The coup would happen next week. Catherine sat there staring at the numbers in front of her, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break out of her chest. She had found everything. Derek Holton, Westfield Holdings, the 3 rival families, the bribed men inside the organization, the coup that was about to happen. She had all the evidence in her hands, enough to hand over to federal authorities if necessary, enough to send Derek to prison, enough to save Conrad's empire. She looked down at the ring on her hand, still standing. She had found justice for her father, and she had also found a way to save the man who had given her a second chance. Catherine stood up, her legs unsteady from sitting too long, her head slightly spinning from lack of sleep. But she didn't let that stop her. She picked up the file she had compiled, then stepped out of the room and went to find Conrad. There wasn't much time left. They had to act now. Catherine found Conrad and Miles in the office at nearly 7 o'clock in the morning. Neither of them had gone home. Just like her, they had stayed awake through the night waiting for news. When she stepped in with the file in her hands, both men looked up at her. Conrad was still seated behind his desk, his face as unreadable as ever, but there was a shadow of exhaustion in his eyes that she had never seen before. Miles stood by the window, holding a cup of coffee gone cold, his gaze sharp and searching. "I found it," Catherine said, her voice rough from lack of sleep, but still clear. She walked to Conrad's desk, set the file down, and began to explain. She pointed out every number, every connection, every piece of evidence. She told them about Westfield Holdings, the shell company Derek was using to coordinate the attack. She explained the partners who had pulled their investments, how each of them had transactions with Westfield Holdings before deciding to walk away from Conrad. She spoke about the illegal money Derek was using, money from his loan sharking operations, money broken into smaller amounts and transferred to wavering men inside the organization to buy their loyalty. She laid out the full picture, a picture Derek had spent 5 years building, 5 years of quietly gathering information, forming ties with the 3 families who had once been Conrad's rivals, preparing his strength, waiting for the right moment. And now, that moment had come. "He doesn't only want to weaken you," Catherine said, looking directly into Conrad's eyes. "He wants to overthrow you, replace you, take everything you have, and from what I've read, he's going to make his move next week." Silence stretched out after she finished. Conrad said nothing. His eyes rested on the file before him, reading every page, every number, every piece of evidence Catherine had gathered. Miles stepped closer, looking over Conrad's shoulder, reading what she had found as well. When Miles lifted his head to look at her, his expression had changed completely. There was no trace left of the suspicion from those first weeks, no trace left of the caution that had once followed her every step. What remained was respect, recognition given to someone who had proven her worth through action, realer than words. Conrad closed the file and looked up at Catherine. His eyes were no longer unreadable stone. There was something brighter in them now, a kind of acknowledgement, a respect she had never seen him offer to anyone except Miles. "What do you propose?" he asked. Catherine had prepared for that question. She had thought about it all night, while her eyes moved across the numbers, and her mind shaped a plan. "Call a meeting with everyone important in the organization," she said. "Present the evidence about Derek in front of all of them. The ones who are wavering will have to choose a side, and when they see that Derek has been exposed, they'll choose the winning side." Conrad looked at her for a long moment. She could feel the weight of that gaze, as though he were weighing not only the plan, but the person standing before him. She had once come to him with her own purpose, had once hidden the real reason she was there, but now she stood before him with everything she had, offering a plan that could save his empire or destroy it completely. Then Conrad nodded. "The meeting will happen tomorrow night," Miles asked, his voice tight with tension. "And Derek?" Conrad rose and walked to the window, looking down over Los Angeles. The city was waking beneath the dawn, the high-rise buildings catching the gold and orange light, the roads beginning to fill with traffic. "Invite him," Conrad said, his voice low and even, but carrying a sharpness Catherine had never heard in it before. "Let him watch with his own eyes how he loses." Miles nodded and left to make the arrangements. Catherine remained standing there a moment longer, looking at Conrad as he stood by the window. He didn't turn around, but he spoke, his voice lower now, almost only loud enough for her to hear. "You did well, Catherine." It was the first time he had called her by name. Not you, not secretary, not any other title, just Catherine. She nodded, though he couldn't see it, then turned and left. She needed a few hours of rest before the meeting tomorrow night. Because after that meeting, everything would change. The following night, everyone important in the organization gathered at Obsidian, a luxury restaurant Conrad owned in downtown Los Angeles. The private room on the top floor had already been prepared, the doors shut, guards standing outside. No one was allowed in or out until the meeting was over. 23 men sat around the long rectangular table, men who had followed Conrad for years, men who held key positions in his empire. They managed the casinos, the real estate projects, the special services. They were the backbone of the organization, the people Conrad trusted most. Or at least, the people he had once trusted most. The air was so tense it was almost impossible to breathe. Everyone knew something was happening, but no one knew exactly what. They looked at one another with measuring eyes, calculating, like animals judging who would survive the night. Conrad sat at the head of the table, his face expressionless as stone, his gaze sweeping across every face in the room. Miles stood behind him, his arms folded, his eyes sharp as a blade. and Catherine stood beside Conrad, a file in her hands, her heart beating fast but her expression calm. She had prepared for this moment. She wouldn't fail. Conrad spoke first, his voice low and even, carrying through the silent room. "I know someone is planning to overthrow me." The faces around the table changed. Some went pale, some went rigid. Some tried to keep their expressions neutral but couldn't hide the flicker of fear in their eyes. Conrad continued, "I know some of you have been wavering, calculating which side you should stand on, and I want to give you one last chance to choose correctly." The silence dragged on. No one dared look at anyone else. No one dared move. The room seemed frozen solid, holding only the sound of heavy breathing and the pounding of hearts each man imagined everyone else could hear. Conrad gave Catherine a slight nod. Catherine stepped forward, set the file on the table, and opened it to the first page. She didn't tremble. She wasn't afraid. She had lived through moments worse than this, had stayed standing when everything around her was collapsing, had learned how to hide fear behind a composed face. Now she only had to do what she did best, present the truth. "Over the past 3 weeks, our partners have pulled their investments," Catherine began, her voice clear and calm. "Contracts have been canceled. Suppliers have ended their cooperation. Many people believed these were random events. They weren't." She turned to the next page and pointed to the chart she had drawn. Every partner who withdrew had ties to the same shell company, Westfield Holdings. And Westfield Holdings is controlled by one man. She paused and looked around the room. Derek Holton. A few whispers broke out, then died immediately. Derek Holton. That name wasn't unfamiliar to the men in the room. They all knew him, knew Conrad had thrown him out 5 years earlier for violating the rules, but they didn't know he had returned, and that he was now targeting all of them. Catherine kept going. She pointed out the illegal money Derek had been using, money from his loan sharking operations, broken into smaller transfers and sent to people inside the organization to buy their loyalty. She read the name of every man who had taken money from Derek, every amount, every date of every transaction. The men she named went pale. Some lowered their heads, not daring to look at anyone. Some opened their mouths as though to argue, but couldn't say a word. The evidence was too clear. There was no way to deny it. Catherine finished in a voice still calm, but carrying a new weight now. "All of this evidence has been backed up in multiple places. If anything happens to me or Mr. Ashford, it will be sent to federal authorities." The room fell into absolute silence. No one dared move. No one dared even breathe too hard. Every man there understood exactly what Catherine meant. If they kept standing with Derek, they wouldn't only lose their positions in the organization, they would lose their freedom. A man seated near the middle of the table rose to his feet. He was one of the men Catherine had named, one of the men who had taken Derek's money. His face was white, sweat shining across his forehead. He stepped in front of Conrad and lowered his head deeply. "I didn't know," he said, his voice shaking. "I was deceived. I'm asking you for one chance." Conrad said nothing. He only looked at the man, his eyes unreadable. Then another man stood up, then another, then another. The ones who had wavered began to turn back toward Conrad, one by one, like a row of dominoes falling in order. They lowered their heads, they apologized, they swore loyalty. They had no other choice. Derek had lost, and they didn't want to lose with him. Catherine stood there, watching the scene in front of her, her heart still beating fast, but no longer from fear. She had done it. She had saved Conrad's empire, and she had found justice for her father. Conrad waited until the wavering men had turned back toward him, until the room had fallen silent again, until every eye was fixed on him in expectation. Then he spoke, his voice low and even, never raised, yet carrying through the room. "Bring Derek in here." The 2 guards nodded and left the room. 10 minutes passed in strained silence. No one spoke, no one moved. They simply sat there, waiting, like an audience waiting for the final act of a play. Then the door opened. Derek Holton walked in with 2 guards at his sides. He was smiling, the confident smile of a man who thought he was about to win. He had been invited to this meeting and had believed it was his chance to overthrow Conrad openly in front of everyone, had already prepared a speech in his head about how Conrad had grown weak and how the time had come for new leadership. But that smile died the moment he saw the faces in the room. The men he had bought were lowering their heads, not daring to look at him. The people he had thought would stand with him were turning their faces away, as though he were a stranger. And Catherine, Thomas Vale's daughter, was standing right beside Conrad, a file in her hand, looking straight at him without the slightest fear. Derek understood immediately. He had lost. The smile disappeared and anger took its place. He turned to look at the men he had bought, the men who had promised to stand with him, but not one of them met his gaze. They had chosen their side. And he wasn't on the winning one. Conrad rose and stepped closer to Derek. The two men stood facing each other, one calm as still water, the other trying to hold back the fury burning inside him. 5 years ago, I gave you a chance to start over, Conrad said, his voice never raised, yet carrying the weight of an entire empire. You spent those 5 years preparing to betray me. Derek clenched his teeth, his eyes red with rage. Who do you think you are? He snarled. Do you think you can control everything forever? Conrad didn't get angry. He didn't raise his voice. He only looked at Derek with a calm expression, as though he were looking at an insect struggling beneath his shoe. I don't control everything, he replied. I only know how to choose the right people to trust. He turned his head and looked at Catherine, his gaze softening just a little. Then he looked back at Derek, and his eyes became ice cold again. You never understood that. Derek tried to answer, tried to say something to save himself, but no one listened. The people in the room looked away. The men he had once bought stared at the floor. The allies he had once trusted stood in silence, as though he didn't exist. He had lost everything. Power, influence, alliances, all of it had turned to dust in a single night. Conrad stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only Derek could hear. I'm not going to finish you, he said. I'm going to let the law do that. Derek went pale. He knew exactly what that meant. Catherine had found every piece of evidence about his operations. The illegal money, the bribery transactions, everything he had done over the past 5 years. And if that evidence reached federal authorities, he wouldn't only lose his little empire, he would lose his freedom. Miles stepped forward and gave the 2 guards a nod. They seized Derek by the arms and led him out of the room. He didn't resist. He didn't have the strength left to resist. He only walked forward with his head lowered and his shoulders slumped, like a beast that had been completely defeated. The door closed behind him. The room remained silent for another moment. Then Conrad turned to the others who were still there. The meeting is over, he said. You may all leave. And once again, I hope there will never be another meeting like this one. They rose, lowered their heads in respect to Conrad, and left one by one. No one dared look at anyone else. No one dared say a word. They only wanted to get out of that room as quickly as possible, forget what had happened, and go on living as though this night had never existed. When the room was empty, leaving only Conrad, Catherine, and Miles, Conrad walked to the window and looked down at the city. Los Angeles still glittered beneath him, still alive and radiant as it was every night. His city, his empire, still his. That night, an anonymous call was made to federal authorities. Along with the call came a package containing every piece of evidence of Derek Holton's operations. Illegal money, bribery transactions, everything needed to put him in prison. 3 days later, Derek was arrested. His little empire collapsed, and the people he had exploited were finally set free. 3 days after the meeting, news of Derek Holton's arrest spread across the city. Federal authorities had received enough evidence to prosecute him on multiple charges: loan sharking, financial fraud, and a long list of other illegal operations he had carried out over the years. His small empire collapsed within hours, like a sandcastle washed away by the tide. The people Derek had once exploited were finally set free. Illegal debts were erased, fraudulent contracts were voided, and the story of Thomas Vale, the jeweler who had been deceived and stripped of everything, was finally brought into the light as one of Derek Holton's many victims. Catherine didn't cry when she read the news. She had cried every tear out of herself 2 years earlier, when her father died in that cold hospital room. Now, all she felt was relief, a deep, profound relief, as though a heavy stone had finally been lifted from her shoulders after years of carrying it. Her father had finally received justice. Inside Conrad's organization, no one wavered anymore. The men who had once calculated which side to choose now knew which side had won. The ones who had whispered behind closed doors had fallen silent, not because they were afraid, but because they had seen that Conrad possessed more than power. He also had talent standing beside him. Someone who could see what others overlooked, someone who could read what wasn't written down, someone who could save an empire with nothing more than 3 sleepless nights and a file full of numbers. Catherine was no longer a secretary. She no longer sat at the small desk outside Conrad's office, arranging schedules and taking notes in meetings. Now she was invited to sit at the table when important decisions were made. She was asked for her opinion on major deals. She was trusted with sensitive information. No one asked why. No one questioned whether she had earned the right. They had all seen what she did that night. Had seen her stand before 23 of the most powerful people in the organization and present the evidence with calm clarity. Had seen her face Derek Holton without the slightest sign of fear. One afternoon, while Catherine was sitting in her new office, a small room but private enough, right beside Miles's office, the door opened. Miles stepped in and stood across from her. He didn't speak for a moment. He only looked at her with an expression that was hard to read. Then he spoke. 3 months ago, I didn't trust you, Miles said, his voice low and even. I thought you were only a lucky girl the boss happened to notice, for reasons I didn't understand. I was wrong. Catherine didn't say anything. She only looked at Miles and waited. Thank you. Miles continued, and it was the first time Catherine had ever heard real sincerity in his voice, for saving everything we built. Catherine looked at him for a long moment, then answered in a calm but steady voice. I didn't save it for you. I saved it because this is where I chose to stay. Miles nodded, a small gesture, but one that carried a respect he had never given her before. Then he turned and walked out without another word. The door closed. Catherine sat there alone, looking down at the silver ring on her ring finger. The ring had grown slightly tarnished with time. It had stayed with her through every rise and fall, had witnessed her lose everything, and build herself back from nothing. She turned it gently, letting the afternoon light fall inside, where the 2 words were still engraved as clearly as the day her father gave it to her. Still standing. Still standing. She had kept her promise to her father. She had remained standing through all of it. And now, she wasn't only standing anymore. She was standing in the place where she belonged. 1 week later, everything had settled. Derek was awaiting trial in federal detention. The 3 families that had once allied themselves with him had withdrawn back into the shadows, not daring to make a move. The men in the organization who had wavered had returned to their places, more loyal than ever. Conrad's empire was still standing, perhaps even more firmly than before, because now everyone knew that betrayal led nowhere but ruin. That evening, Catherine was finishing the last of her work for the day when she saw Conrad step out of his office. He didn't head toward the elevator as he usually did. He walked toward the staircase leading to the rooftop. She didn't know what moved her, but a few minutes later, she rose and followed him. The rooftop of the building was a vast space paved in black stone, with a glass railing overlooking all of Los Angeles. The night wind swept through, cool but not bitter. The lights of the city stretched below like a shimmering carpet, millions of artificial stars flickering in the dark. Conrad stood by the railing, looking down at the city. He didn't turn around when he heard Catherine's footsteps, but she knew she was there. She stepped forward and stood beside him, leaving just enough distance between them, and together they looked down at Los Angeles in silence. The silence lasted a long while. It wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't tense. It was only the silence of 2 people who didn't need words in order to understand each other. Then Conrad spoke, his voice low and even as always, but with something softer in it. That day, when I walked into the pawn shop, I wasn't planning to interfere. I only went there to remind Derek of his place. Catherine said nothing. She only waited. Conrad continued, But I saw the way you held on to that ring, and I realized you weren't like the others. Catherine turned her head and looked at him. Different how? Conrad kept his gaze on the city, but she knew he was speaking to her, only to her. In my world, people let go of everything to survive. But you held on. You refused to let go. I had never seen that in anyone else. Catherine looked down at the ring on her hand, the silver ring worn slightly dull with time, the ring her father had given her on her graduation day 6 years earlier. She remembered that night in the pawn shop, remembered the way Derek had looked at her, remembered the feeling of despair when she thought she would have to sell the last thing her father had left behind. That day, when I walked into the pawn shop, I thought I was going to lose the last thing my father gave me, she said, her voice soft but never weak. I thought I would have to sell everything in order to survive, but I didn't do it. Not because you stepped in, but because even before you appeared, I had already decided I wasn't going to let go. Conrad turned his head and looked at her for the first time since she had stepped onto the rooftop. His dark brown eyes met hers in the darkness, and there was something in them she had never seen before: respect, recognition, and perhaps something more than that. Catherine continued, looking straight into his eyes without looking away. I stayed here not because of gratitude. I stayed because this is where I choose to be, and I don't need anyone to save me. I only needed a chance. Conrad said nothing. He only nodded. A small gesture, almost impossible to notice, but Catherine understood that it carried a deeper acknowledgement than any spoken praise. Then he reached out and touched her hand lightly. His fingers brushed across the silver ring on her ring finger, feeling the cool metal beneath the city lights. You're still wearing it, he said, his voice lower now, almost nothing more than a breath. Catherine looked down at the ring, at the place where his fingers were touching it, then looked back up at him. I'm still standing, she answered. Conrad said nothing more. He didn't need to. And when Catherine let her hand remain still beneath his, she understood that this wasn't gratitude. This was choice. Her choice. His choice. The two of them stood there in silence, looking down at Los Angeles, the city breathing beneath them. The lights stretched into the distance like a glowing carpet, like millions of stars fallen to the earth, like the dreams of millions of people living and fighting to survive. The silver ring still rested on Catherine's finger, tarnished slightly by time, but still carrying the engraved words inside. Still standing. She had once been ready to sell the last inheritance her father left her in order to survive. But she hadn't let go, and now she was standing where she had chosen to stand, beside the man she had chosen, living the life she had built with her own hands. Still standing. Still standing. Thank you all for listening to today's story. If you enjoyed this story, please press the like button to support us. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss more compelling stories every day. And if you have a friend who loves stories about inner strength and the will to keep going, please share this video with them right away. How did this story make you feel? Do you think Catherine made the right decision? Leave a comment below. We'd truly love to hear what your heart felt most deeply. Every comment you leave is a great source of encouragement that helps us continue creating even better stories. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and calm. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.